Within the initiating process group, work begins and the ramp-up for project activities gets underway. If you were to create a graphical illustration of process group activities, the graph representing project initiation would begin at 0 and quickly accelerate. And by the way, planning process group activities and monitoring and controlling process group activities begin at the same time. As planning process activities begin to ramp up, initiating process activities are winding down. Monitoring and controlling process activities gradually accelerate through the initiating, planning, and execution process groups. All process group processes gather inputs and apply tools and techniques to generate outputs. For initiate process group consideration, there are two knowledge areas that promote process work. They are project integration management and project stakeholder management. The project integration management knowledge area has processes that span the project and occur within each process group. For clarity, keep in mind that project integration management knowledge area processes begin with the initiating process group. You don't want to confuse integration, which is a knowledge area, with initiating, which is a process group. So you may ask, how are process outputs developed? Which is a good question, as the answer illustrates the iterative nature of processes within all knowledge areas. So once you come to understand how the processes generate outputs, you'll realize that it happens repeatedly throughout the project lifecycle. First, we take the inputs from the first processes within the project integration management knowledge area, which is develop the project charter. The project charter is among the preliminary documents or artifacts within the project, and it really provides a substantial amount of information at a very high level that represents a need that the project sponsor has. The project will address that need and develop a product that will meet the need or solve the problem of the project. Now, it is important for the project manager to appreciate that the needs expressed by the sponsor may not exactly match the requirements of the project. So the charter is intentionally set up as a preliminary or high-level document that will provide the two crucial next steps. It will identify and designate the project manager and empower the project manager with the authority to drive the project according to organizational process assets. This document will be reviewed and approved by the project manager and the sponsor, at which time project activities may commence. So what does the project manager look for in development of the project charter? The project charter is typically developed by the project sponsor or a business analyst that is not a part of the project team. However, the project manager collaborates in the development of the project charter, and they work closely with the sponsor, who provides the initial information for the project with things like justification, the problem to be addressed, alignment with strategic priorities, overall objectives, and anticipated results. Now, in conjunction with the sponsor deliverable, the project manager would identify stakeholders and interview them relevant to their perspective of the project and its intended deliverables. Stakeholders are any individual or group with a vested interest in the project, either pro or con. Stakeholder analysis provides a greater perspective that the project manager will use later on when requirements are being developed. In support of developing the project charter, the sponsor and project manager will incorporate 5 key inputs: the project statement of work, which helps answer the who, what, when, where, and why type questions; the business case, which is a brief description that illustrates the need and benefits of the project. The business case is often supported by financial analysis, such as net present value and break-even analysis. Contracts, which are used to acquire resources or to take into consideration in regard to anticipated work. In either case, the project manager may be constrained by existing contracts to use resource agreed upon prior to the inception of the project, or they may need to enter into a contract to derive needed resources based upon things like timing of deliverables or subject matter expertise. It's important for the project manager to be aware of the types of contracts that exist and how or when a specific type of contract should be used. Enterprise environmental factors, such as government standards, Organizational infrastructures and market considerations and conditions need to be taken into consideration while developing the project charter, as well as organizational process assets. Organizational process assets should actually really make it easier to develop a charter, as the template and specific directions or procedures necessary to create a charter are defined by the organization and expected to be used to ensure consistency in approach across all project activities. Once all the inputs for the project charter are in place, the project manager collaborates with stakeholders and applies the technique of expert judgment to assess the inputs anticipated to be used in charter development. Expertise typically pertains to technical and managerial activities and come from other units within an organization: consultants, stakeholders, professional organizations, industry groups, subject matter experts, or the project management office itself. The product of those efforts is the project charter, which is the only output of the develop project charter process. The other process activity that takes place within initiating process groups comes from the project stakeholder management knowledge area, and it pertains to stakeholders. Again, stakeholders are the individuals or groups that have a vested interest in a project. That interest can be either in support of the project or against the project. Naturally, the sponsor's perspective provides a good example of activities in support of a project. But to consider where there may be objectives to a project manager needs to look at the big picture and understand the impact that a project could have. For instance, a project could impact the ability of key resources needed for other projects, or it may impact the availability of funds for other work, or it may involve work that trade unions usually do, and there may not be a desire to utilize union resources. For whatever reason, the project manager should be aware of all stakeholders. The PMBOK emphasizes the importance of stakeholder management by saying it is critical for project success to identify stakeholders early in the project and to analyze their level of interest, expectations, importance, and influence. The project manager should enact a strategy that determines the level and timing of stakeholder involvement within a project to maximize positive influences and minimize the potential for negative impacts. The project manager will use the project charter, procurement documents, enterprise environmental factors, and organizational process assets. The project charter will provide details pertaining to both internal and external parties aligned to the project, all of which are individuals or groups affected by the project and thereby are considered to be stakeholders. If a project is the product of procurement activities or based upon existing contracts, the parties identified by the contract would also be considered to be stakeholders. Now, the same enterprise environmental factors come into play iteratively, as do organizational process assets, such as the stakeholder register, lessons learned from prior projects, and stakeholder register from previous projects, all of which can provide insights to the project management team. Those inputs are combined with tools and techniques, such as stakeholder analysis and expert judgment, to deliver the outputs, which are the project's stakeholder registry and the stakeholder management strategy. Stakeholder analysis is the process of getting to know your stakeholder and their role as it relates to the project. The first step is to identify all stakeholders and determine their role, interest, expertise, expectations, and ability to influence the project. Next, identify the potential impact or support of each stakeholder to help define an approach to manage them by. A power interest grid can help you categorize stakeholders so you can then effectively manage to project expectations. The grid can be made up of sections that represent power and interest, which groups stakeholders based on authority and degree of concern for a project. Power and influence, which groups stakeholders based on their level of authority, and active involvement and influence impact, which groups stakeholders by their active involvement and their ability to affect change. Another type of stakeholder analysis is known as a salience model. This groups stakeholders by their ability to impose will, the requirements for immediate attention, and the degree of appropriateness for their involvement in the project. Along with analyzing stakeholders, again by interviewing techniques and using the analytical perspective noted, expert judgment is indicated before, is again applied on an iterative basis to deliver the process outputs, which are the stakeholder register and the stakeholder management strategy. The stakeholder register contains details pertaining to each stakeholder that a project manager would need. Details such as name, organization, contact information, position in the firm, location, role in the project or business. And we can also have asset information, which is the product of the stakeholder analysis. Items like requirements, expectations, ability to influence, and lifecycle phase are of most interest. Finally, the stakeholder register will identify details such as classification, like internal or external, supporter, neutral, or a resistor of the project. The stakeholder management strategy defines the approach that increases support and minimizes negative impacts. It identifies key stakeholders that can impact the project, the degree of participation for each stakeholder, and the groups that they may belong to along with their management. It is important that this type of information, while critical to the project, may be sensitive to syndicate to the entire project team. Calling out an individual, especially a senior manager, as a resistor to a project could be a career inhibitor. So be very careful with this type of information and use good judgment when disseminating it to the project team.